So, next international criminal organization, then in your book, Gangster Warlords. Again, I mean, you just blown me away with all these facts that you're giving us here and the people that you've met. It's just mind-boggling. But here's another one that I'd never heard of: the Shower Posse in
Mm,
Jamaica.
yeah.
What's the deal with them?
So the shower posse, I mean, so the situation in Jamaica, which is obviously really relevant to here in the UK, with a big Jamaican population, and for me it was interesting covering Mexico and covering the violence there, and then these things were kicking off in Jamaica. So I remember in 2010 when I was covering the crazy violence in Mexico, in Jamaica there was this crazy situation where this guy known as the President, Dudus Coke, and his nickname was the President, um, was barricaded in this ghetto area, Tivoli Gardens. The military going in there, eventually they stormed it and carried out this horrific massacre in the place. But before he was holding it out, barricaded up with a bunch of guys with guns barricaded up, defending this ghetto area. So I went to Jamaica to try and find out more about this and also kind of relate that to how that compared to Mexico, Central America, South America. And with a lot of it's very similar to the stuff you see in Central America and Mexico. One of the differences is this has roots going back to the political wars in Jamaica of the 1970s. So in the 70s, you had the left wing against the right wing, two political parties fighting in Jamaica. And these political parties recruited people in the ghetto to create these garrison communities where, nobody, if you were from a different political party, you could not come in there to canvass votes to try and get votes. They would barricade these communities, and these local hard men of the communities were recruited and created these street gangs, which began to call themselves posses, and the leaders began to call themselves dons. Now, Dudus Coke, whose nickname was the President, the interesting thing is in Jamaica, there isn't officially a president. There's a prime minister, and the head of state is Queen Elizabeth II of England. So for him to be calling himself the president, he was like above the prime minister. So he became a political figure on the island. He coming out of this system of politicized gangs. Now their drug trafficking grew in the United States, especially some in England, but more in the United States, with the Jamaican communities in New York, but then spreading right across the US. And in the 80s, they started leaving a lot of bodies around the United States. Now, the US FBI and stuff first didn't really see this. They thought organized crime was like the mafia, Cosa Nostra. They didn't think Jamaicans, was like organized crime. Then they started realizing this is serious organized crime. And they started adding up and said there's been more than 1,000 murders across the United States attributed to these posses. So they started building up cases and deporting a lot of Jamaicans linked to the posses there, back to Jamaica. But like the case of Dudus Coke, they still carried on with the drug trafficking, marijuana, cocaine, also with the political rackets of controlling the neighborhoods. And really, it was quite incredible. His power. He had his own prison in the neighborhood. He had a couple. They had one like minor crimes, like if say some it could be somebody who was just called being a nuisance neighbor. They put him in chicken wire, like sticking there. They had a prison for more like major crimes, and a lot of this was recounted actually in court in New York eventually by a witness, a star witness in the case, known as Cowboy, who I talked to recently, who was actually after being the star witness against Dudus Coke, he was going through facing deportation proceedings from the US to Jamaica. So obviously this guy is gonna, really, really his life is on edge there. So kind of after the US recruited him as a star witness. And a lot of these details really came of describing, and he had quite a good way of describing this. And I talked to him again. He's a good mind for describing how this organization worked. and he was somebody quite deep inside the organization. But I talked to other people in Tivoli Gardens and went there, and you see the kind of power in the neighborhoods and the way it controls these places, but also the way people there look up to these figures. And in Tivoli Gardens, one thing that struck me was that you see there have been massacres by police there, and there were the names on the walls of people who've been killed by the police in these massacres, and these could include old people, but also include young kids, all kinds of people. And then there were these big murals of the drug traffickers and the hitmen. There's big murals of them, so people grow up to see the kind of heroes and the villains, the police being the villains and these drug traffickers being the heroes. And Dallas Coke also put on these major parties. He had these, these like weekly parties, and also had these big parties, one in the summer, one in Christmas, where he'd invite big artists. So there's a lot of big reggae and dancehall artists with songs, to him, and Vibes Cartel, somebody who's apparently linked to him. I tried to go into the prison to interview Vibes Cartel. I couldn't get in there, but Bunny Wailer also had a song about him, which I quote. Now, when I asked Bunny Wailer's people, his song's called "Don't Touch the President," and I asked to quote the song, and he said, "Okay, you can quote a song, but just be clear, I don't know personally Dallas Coke. I'm not a friend of his." That's what, which I put, in that with a quote there of Bunny Wailer. But some other artists as well have songs venerating Dallas Coke, and so he was a major figure. Now, he was eventually, after the massacre, he was arrested and deported to the United States. For a long time, the government refused to arrest him, and our government was really brought down over this because so he was stronger than the prime minister, and the prime minister refused to go against him. So you see, kind of real, like in a lot of what I'm looking at in this book is how these gangs, this is not just cops and robbers. This is gangs influencing politics. This is gangs controlling communities. This is a lot of what we need to deal with when we look at countries around the world today, is to do with crime.
We're going to get to that in a big way when we get to the Mexican cartels. So, growing up, I was familiar with the Yardies. Would the Yardies be foot soldiers for the Shower Posse, or are they different cliques?
So I think the term Yardie was a broader term, I understand, a broader term of the Jamaicans from the posses who went abroad, more like the Yardies. When the Shower Posse went to, I interviewed one, did a long profile on one guy who'd been to New York. I met guys there who'd been in the UK, including being in Manchester and these places. One guy I talked to, he said he'd been in like Moss Side, he knew these places. And he was talking about those, but it was more the United States where they had stronger operations. It's harder to trace a lot of the Yardies in the UK directly to the Posse in Jamaica. There is some links, but it's harder to make those links. Where in the US, they had very, very clear operations running in New York, Atlanta, right across the United States. And this one guy I interviewed went over to US, way back in the early 1980s. And this guy, he'd fought as a trigger man in these political turf wars in Kingston when the political fighting was happening. So he'd been having these gunfights, and then he went over to New York on a false green card. Said it's a false visa, some false ID. He went over to New York, and he arrived there. When he arrived there was a big beef between the Posse there and Jamaican, they're affiliated, and the Latin Kings, and it's in New York. So he just literally got off the plane, and they were talking about this problem they were having, and he said, "I'll go. They don't know me. I'll go." And he was so pumped up from being in these turf wars in Jamaica, where you just shoot people very easily that he went up to this street it was like a high number. I think it's like going to the Bronx area. Went up there where these Latin kings were, and he said he went up there and like shot two of them dead right away.
Wow.
And he just didn't hesitate because he was just so keyed up to it. And that's how when they first went to the United States, they were like on a different level, than these gangs were dealing with. But they say the U.S. authorities eventually clamped down very hard on them. Now they did more. They did a lot of stealing drugs from Colombians, stealing drugs from other people. They did a lot of taking some corners. So they didn't really start to dominate the business in the same way the Mexican cartels did, of really dominating the high levels of a drug distribution.
Wasn't there a scene in Narcos where, was it Chapo? They took over his corner or something, and Chapo flies out from the Cali cartel.
Yeah.
And he takes some of those guys out. He's in the barber shop or something, Godfather style.
Yeah.
Is there a religious influence on the Shower Posse?
So some of them can talk in like certain terms. Like there was people saying, some of the interviews, there were some of the things that were like, don't take Dadas. A guy was saying like you take him as like taking God from heaven, and this kind of rhetoric people would use. Some of the people in Tivoli, I think, would have. There's one guy, for example, I was talking to. We're talking as a religious term, but he was saying that when he was growing up, Dadas Coke was the one who was there. The Shower Posse were the one who were there, who were giving them food, who were giving him school books. They had a thing like back to school, when kids would go back to school for a new term. They would line up there in the ghetto area and hand out school books. So they're giving them, these things. So when you see that, these people are giving them something and the government's giving them nothing, that's when they have that kind of veneration. But that kind of Robin Hood idea, there was definitely there among some of the hardcore. A lot of people, obviously a lot of people don't see that and see that, these the dons are like just destabilizing society, or like really, really bad, that influence of the way it kind of corrupts the country and corrupts politics.
Yeah, you had all the displaced people in Colombia left to die at the scavenging to try and survive at the dumps, and Escobar went in and built homes for them, didn't he? So they were those are the people who showed up at his funeral.